So we have this American ideal of having this white picket fence, single family home. But I think the American ideal should also be being able to start your own business wherever you want and, being able to afford a home in the first place.
Oh, yeah. I agree with both of those things so deeply. Welcome to the Workspace Talk Show, where we talk about every space being a workspace for someone. Today, we're joined by Stefan, professor at Hunter College here in New York City, architect and author of the new book, Dwelling on Earth. Welcome, Stefan.
Thank you, Nathan. So glad to be here.
I really want to start actually with this choice of choosing the Marcus Cicero quote at the beginning of the book here. The gist of the quote is that the built environment is an environment inside of an environment, like that we have this inception of environments. That's how I read it in context of your book. Talk to me a little bit about setting the groundwork, setting the foundation for the thing that we're talking about in Dwelling on Earth.
Yeah, I love that quote because it shows that our built environment is, of course, our function of our choices. But at the same time, it becomes an environment, and then we start to kind of act according to its rules to some extent by creating our own environment. And there's another quote that's really good, also in the book by Winston Churchill's, which is, we shape our buildings thereafter they shape us. And he was at the time referring to the Bond House of Parliament in London. And because it had this kind of dual setup of, one bench facing the other bench. And he thought it was so important to have exactly that same layout because he saw it as partially responsible for the two-party system in Britain.
Yeah,
So
it's interesting. That's a type of design, right? He's designing a solution for a problem that he sees, right? And I think when we think about design or problem solving, that's the kind of thinking that we're thinking about. But I'll tell you really quickly, what strikes me about the introduction quote is that for most people now, that second space is what we call space. That is the environment, and I've heard these numbers 80 or 90% of human life in the first world is spent indoors. I don't know if you have a different piece of data on that or not,
yeah,
but this idea that they have really made that space the environment. And it's kind of the reason I mentioned this kind of inception of spaces is this environment has actually overtaken the environment that's being referenced in the quote, and this really strange reversal of modes. But anyways, I think a little bit about that too, just because there's this idea that when we think about housing specifically, there's very much this animalizing thing that happens when we have this conversation, because it's right, we're mammals and we need shelter, and it has this really kind of base fundamental thing. But then in culture, we've lost I feel like, I'll speak for myself, I feel like in my conversations, we've lost a lot of that. And so I'm curious, in choosing to write a book like this, and especially one that's really history focused, how much are you thinking about the base idea of just why is shelter this way? Why do we design and aestheticize shelter in this way versus just no, I really want to get into the weeds of the architectural history of how the
yeah.
progression happened. What was the experience for you writing that trajectory?
Well, I'm not a traditional historian, of course. I'm a practicing architect. So for me, kind of, I love history, but I always want to put it in the function of the present, in a way that, of course, on one end, it's about appreciating the history and all the endless of number of innovations that have led us to the present moment.
Sure.
But also in a way liberating us from the present, and see that everything around us is, of course, a function of those prior decisions that may or may not make sense anymore. And in a way, it also allows us to rethink the future in a different way. Because, we may look at the walls around us and take them for granted, but, they're really the function of countless kind of decisions that made sense at the time, but maybe not anymore.
We live in this moment where everybody's going to be questioning how we design things and what materials we use going forward. And so where are you at? I guess too, as a professor, what are the conversations? Where are you teaching towards the idea of what this looks like moving forward?
Oh, no, that's a good question. Well, this book really originated during COVID, when all of us were spending a lot of time at home, maybe even more
In
than
those spaces,
90%,
right? Yeah, you're in those spaces they were talking about. Sure.
and living there and working there, and really, I think it prompted a reflection around, how we live, and maybe how can we live better, in more healthy ways, more sustainable ways, more productive ways. And that really triggered kind of a lot of new developments, in cities. I look at New York City, for instance, all the outdoor dining, for instance, and some of the widened sidewalks, and it led people to appreciate kind of outdoor space, more and more, including that, outdoor space as part of the home. So that's kind of where the book originated, and I think, we're having this discussion maybe, partially a result of COVID still, because, we're still, both of us right now are working from home, and
Sure. We're remote.
um,
We're on video.
but remote, right? So yeah, that's, those trends definitely, accelerated. So I would say yes, to a large degree, it was about kind of rethinking how we live. Where did it come from?
Hmm.
Kind of the home, and how has it evolved over the years, and how can we think about the future, kind of more sustainably? In terms of the teaching, I teach both architecture and urban planning students. So the urban planning students, of course, they're really concerned about affordability, affordable
Hmm.
housing. They're all living in New York City, and it's really kind of a housing affordability crisis, that's, it hasn't been this bad since decades. So
Sure.
that's really, kind of top of their mind. And with my, architecture students, I often, talk about how can we rethink how we live, improve quality of life, but also, public health. Think about sustainability, more sustainable materials that are less harmful to the planet.
Sure.
And it's also about, moving away from the Bauhaus style concrete and steel building, which is still so much, part of, education and professional practice.
Yeah. Uh, I need to out myself here and tell you that I wrote my graduate thesis on the pedagogy of Joseph Albers and the techniques that he brought from the Bauhaus to the United States. So I smack my own hand in being part of the problem for continuing that dialogue for this many decades later. But I say that to say too, I think that, the students that you're talking about are also provided this really interesting design challenge ahead of them. And I asked this question a little bit about like, well, will we continue to use the same materials? Will we continue to use to build the spaces in the same way? Or will we find that there are other ways to do this as other technologies influence that? And one of the things I find myself talking about a lot, Stefan, is the idea that none of these tools, no AI, no automation, none of these things are going to help train young people on judgment and problem solving and what actual like that critical thinking aspect is. And I feel like we're in this moment where they have to still get the reps in so that they can bring those things to the table. I was having a drink with somebody last night and they said this. They said, if anybody who is like hasn't really spent a lot of time with any AI tool, the first thing I would tell them to do is the thing that they know the most about on the planet. Spend some time talking to one of the predictive
Hmm.
models or one of the frontier models about those things, because then you'll see how often it's wrong or how much it's
Yeah.
like kind of like
Yeah.
BSing to fill in the gaps and things. And I think that the
Mhm.
students you're talking about have a really
Yeah.
interesting opportunity in front of them. We'll talk about modern day housing in in the United States. I think I know the most about it, so that's the area where I'll stick. I'll stick in my lane a little bit here. We have a massive housing crisis happening. We're millions of homes short of what we need in the United States. When you go and you do this history, I'm curious if you have thoughts on is this a modern phenomenon, this housing crisis, this housing shortage that we have in the first world and in the second world and in the third world? It just needs to kind of like flow holistically throughout the whole or systematically
Yeah.
throughout the whole world. Is that new? Is it something that's always
Mhm.
been there? What is your read on that through the history experience? Like, what is your read on that dynamic?
Well, if you look at the deep history of habitation, you really see how technology plays a role in
Mm.
essentially putting more people on unit of land. And
Uh-huh.
we always talk about the steel frame and the elevator, right? 19th century elevator innovations that helped Manhattan and other places grow upward. But the history goes much deeper than that. Think about ancient Rome, for instance, where you had 1 million people living in a couple square miles. And what was the most common building typology? It was the multi-story apartment building. It's
Mm.
kind of the ancient walkout, sometimes up to 8 stories. And they were pretty dangerous to build at first because they're built out of wooden frames and kind of plastered over with mud. And there were fires, and it was pretty dangerous, especially the upper stories. But then came Roman concrete, and you get these very beautiful multi-story vaulted Roman buildings that are really, really nice. And not just for the middle class, in a way, solving the affordability problem for the middle class, allowing them to live pretty central, a stone throw away from the Forum, and be close to all the activities of the urban center of Rome, or Ostia, which was a port city, has a lot of them. But even upper middle class people would live in these kind of apartment buildings. It wasn't
Mm.
all like the domus. So technology really enabled that. But also design. If you look at the early agricultural societies, maybe 6,000-7,000 years ago, there is a shift that is really interesting. Is the first dwellings, virtually in any culture, they were all round. It's kind of these pit dwellings,
Mm-hmm.
and simple. And why were they round? Because a round hole is pretty easy to build. So it doesn't require a lot of tools. It doesn't require masonry or skills or anything like that. And then, as societies became more successful with agriculture, they virtually all shifted from round to rectangular. And why is that? Because the needs of agriculture require more people per household, especially when you start to do irrigation and
Mm-hmm.
all that, digging canals and so on. So you had more people per household, and you see that the round dwelling doesn't really help anymore. If you want to expand,
You
add
need that
another
space in the
room,
corners.
you need the corners,
Yeah.
exactly. So they started building these multi-room square buildings, and
And Stefan,
some.
can you tell me, do you know eras? Because I know by the time we get to what I think of, I don't know this history as well. When we get to Teotihuacan, when we get to the pyramids, we're very
Yeah.
square. Everything's very square, right? So if we're getting there, like, where is that happening before that era?
Yeah, it starts, probably the first time we really saw that was in Mesopotamia, and kind of leading up to the first cities like
So we're
Ur,
thinking
for instance.
ziggurats, kind of like that kind of.
Yeah, the ziggurat era.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, it happened across the world in cultures that had no contact with another. It's almost like we were bound to stumble upon it because we're pretty uh, innovative, right? As people, and for the same reason, we kind of stumbled upon agriculture. It was just kind of a logical thing to do. We also stumbled on the pit house, and then later on the rectangular house. So that's really quite fascinating. We just figured out this was kind of a practical thing to do.
I'm thinking about this idea of like, okay, so you go down this path, you get the
Yeah.
corners, and then you start to have, to your point, you start to have some like urban planning, right? You start to have
Yeah.
development, agricultural development. Yeah.
Yeah. Essentially, techniques that allowed more people to live closer together, right? From the elevator to the rectangular building to concrete to steel frames. And that in a way solved the big problem. And then of course there's all this other kind of techniques associated with that, like how do we get the wastewater out? How do we get clean fresh water, and
Hmm.
all these other kind of
Site
urban
site
planning
selection
innovation,
and
site selection. Yes,
some of these things.
exactly.
Okay, look, as a commercial real estate guy, I'm forced to ask myself this somewhat ridiculous question, and so you're going to be burdened with my somewhat ridiculous question here for a second, which is, you just described like this thousands of years history of how we think about building houses and where those go and how community is developing around agriculture. But when we think about what's the second type of space that is getting built, like, I assume it has something to do with agriculture. But in doing this research, did you find anything that was like, oh, the next thing after shelter we decided to build was this thing?
Yeah, no, there's a couple things. So one is storage. Initially, kind of these as these agricultural societies began, they initially had these other stories that weren't part of their dwelling, other structures, and that was for storage.
Hmm.
That were usually kind of a little bit smaller, or sometimes bigger, but they were just used for storage. Then later on, as we shift from round to rectangular, the storage becomes internalized. It becomes privatized essentially. It
Uh-huh.
becomes just
For
another
security.
room. Well, it's kind of the dynamic shift. As some archaeologists think that before, kind of risk was pooled along the village, right? So you
Interesting.
share your surplus from your farm, right? Your extra grain or whatever it may be. So in times of droughts or floods, when there's no food, you can share that among the village. But then later on, as the village grew bigger, and the relationships are probably a little bit different when you get to these larger settlements, and that nobody was, maybe not everyone was related by blood anymore, but more by proximity.
Hmm.
You see that this storage becomes privatized. So that's one of kind of the early buildings. I guess the other one is kind of the temple or the palace. And very early on, it appeared that these kind of emerged from the house. Like if you look at Mesopotamia, for instance, the first temples and palaces, they look like larger versions of the house. But you're probably also thinking about work, right? Workspaces, and kind of more industrial places. Up until the Industrial Revolution, the home was also a commercial space. You could argue, because it was also a workshop. So we see that at the very early homes. So for instance, in Mesopotamia, like Tel
Mm.
Brak, that these were like little workshops where they would chip on obsidian, which is this volcanic glass, and was quite precious at the time, and they use it for knives and other things. Um, so yeah, there was no distinction between the home and the workplace in a way similar today with work from home. That starts to change in the industrial revolution when, for instance, the terrace rows of industrial Britain,
Sure.
where you are living away from the smog in the factory, and you just have a house. There's no commercial activity that happens there, and we're kind of familiar with that idea of the home today.
If you think then about that, did spaces weren't large, dwellings weren't that large for people.
Hmm.
And so the kind of living space was then also a multifunctional space, I guess, in those
Hmm.
settings. Is that how it was designed?
Well, if you look at, for instance, the ancient Greek dwellings, they're about two times bigger than current average
Oh, wow.
average European house. So
Oh, that's
so
amazing.
that some of them were actually quite big. Now, of course, if you go back earlier, of course, it's much smaller. But yeah, the Roman domus was actually quite nice. Now obviously the people who lived there were more kind of upper middle class. They kind of made it, and they had sometimes two gardens in Rome. They had these colonnades. They had mosaics. But then you also had people that lived in the multi-story apartments, of course. So kind of this inequality, you already see very much so during those times.
I know that you went to UCL and then to Berkeley. We talked a
Hmm.
little bit about that. And, I have a personal connection to Cal Berkeley, and
Hmm.
I do find that community to be one where it's one of the most painful experiences in the United States for me to look at as a environment, in that the average house value is so high. The desire for um, equality there theoretically is also high. As a liberal bubble, they think of themselves as
Hmm.
being a space where that kind of equality would exist. And then when it comes down to brass tacks and actually making the rules and the policies, they've just chosen everything
Yeah,
against the idea of the expansion of dwellings in their community.
yeah, yeah.
When look, I won't pick on Berkeley specifically because I'm sure there's
Mm,
going to be some listeners there in Berkeley.
yeah,
But can we just talk about for a second, when you think
yeah,
about that problem and you think about
yeah.
dwellings moving forward, what do you foresee, or what are you experiencing Maybe what are you experiencing even as an architect about how you think
Yeah.
some of that will be addressed?
If you look at the United States, what's really causing a lot of trouble in terms of affordability is kind of the idea of zoning,
Hmm.
which started in New York City, but 100 years ago. But Berkeley also had a role in it early on. And initially, it was kind of a way to protect the public, right? If you think about modern zoning, and a lot of it actually emerged from Germany. Frankfurt was the city with the first zoning code, and in a
Mm.
way, it was to kind of protect residential areas for factories. So if you think about that big idea that you're protecting people, making them safer so they don't breathe in factory air, right?
Sure.
But
Sounds
but
good.
to,
Sounds good on paper. Like, yeah, we all want that. Sure.
but then today, of course, yeah, I mean, the New York City zoning code in 1916 and had maybe like a dozen pages. Now it's 4,000. It's become really complicated, and at the same time, really restrictive, meaning that it's very hard for new development to merge. When you want to change zoning maps, for instance, you get the NIMBYism and other obstacles. So in a way, it's no longer about kind of protecting people. It's really about kind of the perception of protecting property rights
Yep.
and land values. So that's a shame, because if you look at other countries, zoning is a lot more flexible. So, for instance, including that original zoning code in Frankfurt, it was much more open to mixing uses. For instance, you can have
Hmm.
a residential area and you could still have a bakery, the kind of, or a corner restaurant or something like that. And in the United States, those kind of R1 zones of detached single-family homes really became just residential and a little bit sterile as a result. Or you use the example of Japan. Japan is also incredibly mixed, and you get these building typologies that are like 5, 6 story buildings. They're kind of narrow and small, but on the top floor they have a sushi bar, then they have a hairdresser underneath, and maybe someone would live underneath that, and it's really leads to a very vibrant type of place where also in a way it's quite conducive to starting businesses, right? So we have this idea, this American ideal of having this white picket fence single family home, but I think the American ideal should also be being able to start your own business wherever you want, and being able to afford a home in the first place.
Oh yeah.
So
I agree with both of those things so deeply. And you would think that if you just said like what we think of as the American topology, starting a business seems core to our foundation and to like what independence looks like in the United States. And yeah, being able to kind of like have these spaces and use them in the way that you want also seems really core to that kind of freedom. But you and I probably have both seen this, where an American then goes to Europe and sees exactly that description you're talking about. You go to Paris and you see this bakery inside of the building and whatever, 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 and the whole combo of things, the constellation that's happening over a building, over a block, over a square block, over a city is so beautiful and diverse in a way that we don't see in the United States. So we feel very sterile, especially when you look at middle America, where you're driving and even every coffee shop is individually a standalone building. And then every store
yes.
is a standalone building. And they all have drive-throughs and
Hmm.
parking lots and whatever. Those
Yeah.
environments really feel segmented and don't have the integration or the connective tissue that these other communities do. And back to something you were talking about thousands of years ago, us looking for these ways to consolidate or bring it together so that there's density and that we have that togetherness, that gets lost a little bit in the description I just gave. And when we travel abroad, we still see that. And I think that's really an amazing point. And I know, we live and work in New York City, and we have a taste of it here, and
Hmm.
there are places in the US, a couple of places that have a taste of that, but I think to your point, the zoning in New York City and across the United States really is restrictive in a way that you don't get the
Hmm.
integrated cultural integration, company integration in the way that you're describing it all, for sure. I'm really in the business of thinking about how automation and tools are going to help work towards the development of building spaces and thinking about this in a moment where I don't know if you're following this, but 5 Times Square is going to be the largest single conversion of
Mm.
commercial to residential in New York City history. It's 1.1 million square feet. That seems to me like the exact thing we want to see happening, because now back to this idea that we have all of these third spaces that used to be offices or built for knowledge workers. And as we see more of those spaces not being needed for those purposes, we have to reuse them and we have to
Yeah.
reconsider or redesign. But just,
Hmm.
yeah, share with me and tell me your thoughts on the idea of this type of conversion and how we might see this happening in other countries or other parts of the
Yeah.
country.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And it is definitely a trend in the United States. A lot of big cities. I just read this article on Denver. Somebody just bought a bunch of office multi-story buildings and going to convert them into residential as well. New York in a way leading the pack. I think it's happening elsewhere too, but the unique difference here with the United States is that our office buildings are really quite fat, right? And that's also a function of building regulations. So, for instance, in the Netherlands, where I'm from, you can't have a window. You can't have an office space that's too far away from a window. It's kind of a function of how high the ceiling is, because that kind of determines how deep the daylight penetrates into the building. So you don't get these kind of massive floor plates, these 200-foot wide buildings that we see in the United States. So the conversion challenge that we may see in the Netherlands or other countries is not as difficult as we're having them in the United States.
Yeah.
So what are some of the challenges? Well, you already mentioned one of them. They're massive floor plates. Your residential unit cannot be as deep as an office floor plate.
Yeah.
What do you do with all these kind of interior dark spaces? Well, maybe those could become, gyms or community spaces or other things, right? But yeah, that's a challenge. Another challenge is that, a lot of times these office buildings, they may have windows on the front and the back, but not on the sides, right?
Sure.
So what are you going to do there? Then they're also, built pretty sturdily, right? Some of these floors are super thick, reinforced concrete. How do you open those up if you wanted to?
Yeah,
You
it's going to
probably
be
have
very
to.
difficult
And
to add a shaft down 35
yeah,
floors of that kind of
yeah,
building, right? It's never going to happen. The cost immediately makes it not worth the project, right?
yeah.
I would even just say, like a quick aside to that, when it comes to economics, we just see residential per square foot values versus commercial square foot values still not being equal. And as long as
Mm.
the commercial values are still worth more, even if they're vacant, they'll write off the vacancy over converting it because the math doesn't work. And so, like, that's not even related to how difficult it is to actually design and build a shaft solution or a whatever the different solutions are. I'll let you speak to those as the architect. I'll stay out of the design business.
No, no. There's of course the money part, right? I mean, this is very expensive, and think also about you have to redo all the HVAC systems, access, and so
Yeah,
on.
sure.
Now, luckily in New York City, because of the recent zoning code changes through City of Yes housing affordability, they're making it easier to convert these spaces, particularly into SROs, like single room occupancy
Yeah.
units. But still, if it's too expensive, no one's going to do it. So the value of those office buildings would have to drop enough for that to be justified.
Yeah, for sure. Stefan, as we come to an end here, I'm just curious if we're thinking about, just the way that you're moving yourself, the way your trajectory is set, your goals as a professor, as an architect. What are you focused on, and what are you thinking about as the next area where you really want to push yourself or you want to innovate? Where are you going next with this thinking about um, either full on architecture or about dwellings themselves?
No, I think there's so many opportunities today because also partially because of new technologies, and I'm seeing that with my own practice in that it's much easier to scale things. For instance, visualizations. You used to be having to do that with some outsourced rendering provider. It would cost you $1,200 per image. And
Sure. Yeah.
now you can just do it in house so quickly. In a way, it's also empowering my urban planning students who were always on the weaker side in terms of visualization, if you compare them to the architects, right? 3D modeling software, visualization, rendering, all that is becoming in a way more accessible because of AI. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity there. So the tools are evolving, and we need to stay ahead of them. But at the same time, the challenge is also increasing, right? We have housing affordability. We have global warming. We have so many things we need to worry about. At the same time, we want to elevate people's quality of life. So yeah, how can we do that? So the challenge in a way becomes harder because we have more people, more challenges, more of affordability issues. But at the same time, our tools are maybe improving. So hopefully we'll be smart enough to be able to solve those challenges. But if you look at kind of the long history of dwelling, we always come up with solutions, and I think that is the positive note of the book. We are a very innovative species, right?
Yeah.
And we, when we're put to the test, we make a lot of problems. We create problems, but for ourselves, but then we also tend to solve them, and that solution often then creates another problem that we then end up having to solve again later on. So I'm optimistic, and I'm excited to be able to tackle those problems and also teach the people and give
Yeah,
them the
I
tools so
I
they can
love
do it
that answer.
themselves.
I love that answer so much. Yeah, like if you'd asked me, I wouldn't say bet against humans. Betting against humans throughout the history of humankind would have been a bad idea all across the way because we are so innovative, we're so adaptive, and that when we see a
Hmm.
problem as a community, and even though we're a very large community now, we tend
Hmm.
to come together, even when it seems like we won't or whatever. We tend to come
Hmm.
together and find those types of solutions. So I think that that's a really
Hmm.
wonderful answer. Thank you for that. Stefan, if people wanted to learn more about you, wanted to find your book, where would they go to get access to your book, get a copy of your book, and learn more about you?
Yeah, you can learn more from my website, www.stefanl.com, or you can just type in Dwelling on Earth, and that's the latest book. It's available everywhere. Yeah, feel free to reach out anytime. Love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for your time. Everybody, check out Dwelling on Earth. I got my copy on Amazon and read it on Kindle, and the illustrations were created on Kindle. So if you're curious about the experience on that, that was really wonderful. Thank you again so much for your time today, Stefan.
Thank you. It was a true pleasure.
Hey y'all, Nathan here. If you've made it this far, you're clearly interested in construction, architecture, and commercial real estate. So head over to our YouTube channel and check out some other episodes. And while you're there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps our channel grow. Want to connect with us directly? Find us on LinkedIn, where we chat with guests, listeners, and some of the best businesses in our industry. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.